Friends, I'm grateful today to have the opportunity to speak with Tony Robinson. He's agreed to talk with us about congregational life and leadership, its challenges and delights. Tony is ordained in the United Church of Christ in the U.S. He's the author of the recent Useful Wisdom, a book I've read from cover to cover. And I just loved his emphasis on the joy of calling in ministry and his clear sense that ministry isn't all up to us, that God is a real live agent in the world. The book was occasioned by a request from some younger clergy, including his daughter, who asked, would you write us some letters with your advice about a bunch of things we're trying to figure out? And so Tony wrote the book. He's well known also for his transforming congregational culture and what's theology got to do with it. He writes a regular blog and coaches clergy, some of whom I know. He encourages them and he encourages congregational leaders. Lately, Tony is helping VST reimagine and revitalize field education in conversation with our alumni and students and faculty and church partners. And I have to say, it's just been a pleasure to work with them. Welcome today, Tony.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's I've had associations with VST for really quite some time, first coming to VST probably as far back as the 80s as a summer school student, and then teaching several times in the summer session. And I've been delighted particularly to see the way that VST has been transformed and reformed under your leadership and that of a number of other faculty there. I wouldn't have placed money on that 30 years ago, but it's happened, and it's a great thing for Canada and for the Northwest.
Oh, thanks so much. Tony, we're very interesting. You're hearing a lot of literature now talk about flourishing or vital congregations, and we're all interested in them. But what is a flourishing congregation? What does it look like? And could you give us some examples of congregations who are doing, in your view, great work?
Yeah. This may sound a little squishy, but I think one thing is just the feeling of energy in the life of a congregation. And one thing I've noticed over the years is that most congregations manage to get a little energy cranked up in the half hour before worship. People are greeting one another and people are practicing, and this is pre-COVID. And there's a kind of a sense of something of anticipation, of a joy even. But the churches that are flourishing, in my view, have more of that after worship than they do at the beginning. Whereas churches that are not flourishing, it feels like the air is kind of out of the balloon at the end of worship. That it's oh my, another week. Yeah. So that's a vague answer, but I think I think God is there is a kind of an energy in our experience of God's presence, a vitality in itself, of being in the presence of the holy and mysterious and loving and grace-filled God that energizes people.
Yes.
And you can feel it in the after worship time, in whatever is the version of fellowship hour, or maybe people just chatting with one another. And so that's one. And I think in congregations I've served, I would say that one of the things I was particularly attentive to was when we felt, had the felt sense of God's presence in worship. And of course, it doesn't happen every Sunday. We're not in charge. The Holy Spirit is. But and we sometimes confuse God's energy or the transcendent treasure that we have in earthen vessels with simply being perky or playing a lot of loud music ourselves. It's not the same.
Yes.
So another one I'd say at flourishing is that there's an outward orientation.
Yeah.
That people are kind of turned outward to to the human need and longing, to the community, that they're not focused entirely on the inner life of the congregation or just meeting. And one that I'd call out for that was Finney Ridge Lutheran Church in Seattle, where my friend Paul Hoffman was a lead pastor for a long time. And they realized sometime in the latter part of the 20th century that there weren't any more Scandinavian immigrants coming to Seattle to fill up their churches. In fact, that had stopped sometime in the 50s or 60s. And so they began to think about a recovery of the catechumenate in a kind of a 21st century form. And they developed a ministry called The Way, which was an adult spiritual formation, so that when you had someone come to church and say, I'm interested in growing spiritually. I'm not sure what that means, but do you have anything for me? A lot of churches can only say, well, you can get involved in this service project, or you can serve on this committee. But we don't seem to have things that are kind of at the basic catechetical level, and that are not just kind of like a doctrine dump, but are building relationships, teaching spiritual practices, and letting people ask the most basic questions. And I saw that at Finney Ridge with The Way, and they were reaching. In Seattle, we have a lot of young adults. It's kind of a young adult city, and many of them are either have had no church background, or they've had a church background that has left them either hurt or confused. And so there's a real, I think, opportunity for adult formation, and churches that believe enough in the gospel message and in the power of the presence of Christ that they get into that. So they're turned outward. Finney Ridge would pray regularly, Lord, send us people who are looking for you, who are seeking you. And it's surprising how many churches that talk about a desire for church growth that never ask God to send people to them, or are prepared to deal with them when they come. So I think an outward orientation is another one I'd signal. A third one that I had something to do with a church in Louisville, Kentucky, which had been principally a German congregation, but the Germans had all moved away out into the suburbs. And so most of the people around the church were African American. And again, kind of an outward orientation instead of just focusing on the 15 old Germans who were left. There was a kind of turning outward to the community. And I met the pastor, an African American woman, at an event I was speaking at. And I said to her, I've heard about your church. I'd like to visit. And she said to me, we'd love to have you come and see what God is doing. And what struck me about that was it wasn't come and we have a really friendly congregation or we are really super busy. It was come and see what God is doing. There was a sense of the active agency of God, which I think theologically does not override or eliminate the human agency. They're compatible. But there was a sense that God was alive and up to something in the world. And I think that's another sign of a flourishing congregation. So kind of energy that is grounded in the energy and the work of God, outward orientation, feeling called to interact with all sorts of people, and engage them in a way that has integrity and love, and a sense of the agency of God, of the living God.
Yeah, and people seem to be, as you express it, articulate about that too. They're able to say that.
Right. Yeah. I think that is one of the continuing gifts of the African American church to our whole society is their capacity to speak of God as the subject of the verbs. So often in dwindling mainline churches, we are the subject of all the verbs. We have to do this, we have to do that. we should feel this, we should feel that.
Yes.
And I think it's just, it's not that interesting.
Thank you. You've spoken about some flourishing congregations and some of their characteristics, but what do you think are the biggest challenges then? Maybe that's strongly related to this, but what are the biggest challenges that pastors or ministers or priests face in the church just now? We're in the same kind of corridor here in Cascadia, so I think there would be some similarities for us.
Yeah. Well, of course, in the immediate, we're the pandemic and how the church has had to adjust and respond to that. And I don't think any of us knows at this point quite how we come out of that.
Yeah.
But it has posed some, I think, enormous challenges for clergy who have had to learn a lot of new tricks very quickly.
Yes.
And may be exhausted from that. One of the ironies of modern technology is it doesn't actually make us less busy. It just seems to mean that we're expected to do more in shorter time.
Yes.
So we all suffer from that. I guess I would say, it is a little bit the mirror image of the things I've been talked about. The congregation that has turned in on itself, that has become a kind of club for the comfort and satisfaction of its members, and where people get very irritated if things don't suit them.
Yes.
And I understand a certain amount of that, but really the church, what was the old expression about it? A fire lives by burning, by turning outward.
Yes.
So I think the church that is turned inward and preoccupied only with meeting the needs of our existing membership,
yes,
is that's kind of a bad place to be, in my view. I think leadership is a challenge in churches. When I was coming up, leadership was frankly in my denomination sort of a suspect, if not a negative word. As was power, and they were often conflated. Certainly we have plenty of instances of leaders who have been abusive of power and have manipulated people. I don't think we're as aware as we need to be of what happens when you don't have effective leadership, when a vacuum is created. And because inevitably that vacuum will be filled, and it'll often be filled with people in congregations, in my experience, who aren't accountable, who have their own personal needs for power and prominence and prestige that is often not helpful to the body as a whole. So I think for leaders to kind of get up on their hind legs and actually lead in a way that is not obviously dictatorial, but gives the congregation a sense of direction, and gives the congregation a sense of what are the things that we ought to be focused on. So many leaders in my generation seem to be of a mind that we just would ask the people what they were interested in. And okay, that's important in a sense. You always want to include people and to elicit their participation, but I don't think that most laity have the view of the congregation that a clergy leader who has gotten themselves a certain amount of trust do. They see, and they should see, the whole as well as the parts.
Yes.
Laity, by and large, tend to see the part they're most interested in. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are very gifted lay leaders, and we need those. But without leadership, congregations drift. And I think there's a lot of drift and a lot of kind of, so then others step into the void, and you tend to get wrapped around the axle over things that really aren't that important. So those are some thoughts.
Just to relate it to your previous question, Tony, what do you think about, Charles Taylor talks about the ethics of inarticulacy, and he talks a lot about how people, they know they're for good causes, but they're not quite sure why. And he thinks that that's a challenge for, he talks about Protestant Christianity, but for his own confessional, he's a Roman Catholic. What do you think he's on to something there?
I think we have neglected, and it's kind of another hoary word, basic catechesis for a long time.
Yeah.
The assumption, again, when I was coming up, was that everybody was mostly some kind of Christian. I grew up on the East Coast of the U.S., where that's maybe a little more sustainable, as an illusion. On the West Coast, that becomes more problematic, but I think that is a good thing, not a bad thing, that we understand ourselves as a mission field. But I do think that we tended to think of the church as good people getting together with other good people to do good things for the world. And, that's obviously not a bad thing, but I don't think it's an adequate thing.
Yes.
And oftentimes then when you have some real problems in a church, people are surprised, like, well, I thought churches were just full of, really nice, caring people. And no, we are full of sinners. But we haven't given people language to kind of understand that, and to come to grips with it and to go deeper when the veneer of just being good people gets worn off a little bit. So I think the name of the game, the term we tend to use for it now is faith formation, which it's interesting because formation is really a word that has a lot stronger currency and longevity in the Catholic tradition. But I think it's right but sometimes what we seem to mean by faith formation is something that's fairly therapeutic, and that when I encounter God, it means I have a lump in my throat or a tear in my eye, and emotions are important and everything, but I think there's some core convictions. You mentioned my book, What's Theology Got to Do with It? And my argument there was that reasonable clarity about core Christian convictions and the ability to make them sensible and relevant is the key to church health. That it's not just a matter of having systems theory all down or some other forms of programmatic renewal. We have to have some theological substance and integrity. To me, the whole project I've been involved in my whole ministerial life really is to be deeply rooted in the core convictions of Christian faith and engaged widely in the world, which means beyond just the church. And to hold those together, deeply rooted, widely engaged, has been the enterprise that has interested me. There's a nice image in some book, I've forgotten the title of it. In Australia, they have, cattle stations, which we would call ranches, but they don't have fences. They keep the flock or they keep the herd sort of in proximity by having a place where they can get water in this dry, barren countryside.
Yes.
And I think of the church that way. We've got to be what holds you together is not necessarily fencing others out or fencing others in, but having a source of nurture, of refreshment, of the living water.
Yes.
The cattle in Australia, my daughter spent a year there working on a cattle station, will not stray too far from the source of water.
Nice. Thank you. So we've talked about a number of things that are challenges, that what a flourishing congregation looks like. So if you were to give advice to somebody who is a brand new graduate, they're going out to their first congregational assignment, and a lot of that will be contextual and local, depending on what a particular situation needs. But where are the good places to begin in your experience if you're going to engage a congregation in ways that we've talked about that would lead to something thriving? It's not just a what to do list, but you would have to do some discernment. But where have you seen smart pastors, wise pastors begin?
Well, I think it begins with building trust, which, alas, is slower to build than it is to destroy. But it begins with trust in relationships. And sometimes that means that as a new pastor, presumably in the search process, the people in the search have said, well, we're struggling with this, or we feel we have needs around that, or we'd like to work on this, or that's been neglected. I think it's wise to take those seriously. They may not be as deep an analysis of the congregation's challenges as you will ultimately make, but people need to know you've heard them and that you are taking seriously what they have said. So I think that's part of building trust, is not being indifferent to what people are telling you. And frankly, you build trust by listening, and you build trust by showing up. And if you're lucky, there'll be a crisis that you're not responsible for. The church will burn down, or there'll be a huge fight going on when you get there. So you're not the focus, but you can. When you have a crisis, it often gives good leaders a chance to really step forward and ramp up that process of trust building that can take longer. But I think building trust is where it begins, and that means, on the one hand, that you're not a blank slate. You have some ideas, and you're willing to share those, and you can say, I've had this crazy idea. Can you help me make it better? But you're also listening, and you're trying to discern what Ron Heifetz calls the song beneath the words. Because what people say about themselves and about their church, on the one hand, if they're articulating felt needs, pay attention to that. It's kind of how we pay the rent and build up credit to do other things that are more important, perhaps more important. But I think another way to put it is a task in the first couple years is to define reality. What's going on here? Yes. Some of that will be listening to the members of the congregation and to key leaders, people of influence. Some will be listening to people in the wider community. I'm new here. Tell me what you think's going on in this community. How do you think this church that I'm now serving has been perceived in the community? So I think a lot of trying, in some ways, to sort of come at it as an anthropologist. And what makes this culture tick? What are the profound symbols? What are the rituals that are important? And so I think I just think it's a great place for curiosity. And in my experience, good pastors are kind of curious people. They're curious about other people. They're curious about what seems to be lively and that kind of thing. So building trust, defining reality, and then giving people a kind of your read on things. I would always encourage pastors to do an occasional state of the church sermon, and not you pick an appropriate Sunday, whether it's near the annual meeting or near the end of the program year, beginning or whatever. But I think you give people, this is how I'm seeing things. Does this make sense to you? This is how I'm seeing some of our important challenges. What do you think about that? Because that's a way of giving leadership, is you give people something to bounce off of.
Yes.
You don't ram it down their throats and saying my way or the highway, but you do give them, well, that's interesting. He thinks or she thinks that this thing that we thought was really important has some downsides. Or he or she thinks we have a real opportunity to minister to this group of people in the community, but we haven't found out how to make a connection with them.
Okay. So some reality testing in some way.
Reality testing.
Yeah.
Reality testing.
Good. We're living through, you've mentioned COVID and, its impact on the church and leaders, I suppose in some instances, initially scrambling and then finding some facility with denominations. And in my experience, have been pretty good at trying to help pastors and ministers with the skill sets that they have needed for this online time. One of the things that made me hopeful during COVID-19 was that we can change if we have to quickly, which was remarkable, actually. So that's one of the things that's made me hopeful. But what are you hopeful about in terms of the future of the church, and not just in the abstract, but for the future of congregational ministry? Where do you see the signs of light breaking out?
Well, I think where you have an effective pastoral leader who is, kind of is a believer, and where you have some mature lay leaders, I don't think being a lively church is all that hard. I mean, it's not like when I kind of started out my writing and speaking, maybe in the 80s, I was kind of saying, there's some handwriting on the wall for us mainline churches. We think we're the mainline, but actually, we may be kind of out on the edges in terms of where the culture is, and then something happened. And I was kind of saying, well, there's some things we need to look at here. We can't, like that Scandinavian Lutheran church, we can't just count on automatically people being a part of a church anymore, or just coming because we have a denominational franchise or something like that. Those days are over. So I said that for a while, and then I began to feel like I would visit churches that had gone from denial that we've got any challenges to despair. And kind of, there is no hope. We've read the New York Times, and it says the mainline church is dying. And I guess we'll just have to adjust to that and sort of figure out how to have hospice care. And I don't think that's right. I think that people are hungry for vital, authentic, loving, engaged, gospel preaching congregations, and who have some good news to share, are not out of touch with the fact that there's a lot of suffering and brokenness in life. But I just think that when you get your priorities in line and really believe in what you're doing, I think people respond. I think there's it's a cliche to say this, but that there is a spiritual hunger. I mean, I think we've been so long on such a materialistic track. I wrote something the other day that I was really struck by this. I read some psychologist saying that, puberty is the body's way of saying a person wants to matter. It's the time to really give our young people something to say you matter and life matters, and here's something worth living for.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that what we've mostly said about puberty of late is either get very sexually active or don't get sexually active at all.
Mm-hmm.
That it's mainly about hormones, sex, and kind of getting hairy, and it's all physical. It's all material.
Yes.
There's very little of the spiritual. There's very little saying, yes, your body is coming of age, and it means that you have a role to play, and your life is important. And let us involve you, or let us be a partner with you in doing some things that matter, that excite you. And I just thought that was kind of a brilliant insight. And the larger article in which it occurred was on purpose-driven schools, which sounds a little bit like the Rick Warren rhetoric, but still the idea, in this case, it was a Jewish school, and the twofold emphasis was what does citizenship mean, and what does it mean to be a person of faith? And they were really engaging young people around this and in diverse cadres. And I just thought that was so refreshing as compared with, oh, Lord, these people are having a lot of hormones, and we either need to, get them on birth control immediately, or we need to, that's our main challenge. I don't think that's our main challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And
Tony, I love the tone of your voice when you're talking about church, that the hope comes through, that you're committed to this. You remind me of, I think it was Will Willimon who once said, because God raised Jesus from the dead, he's a prisoner of hope, which is, Will's way of putting things.
Yeah. Well, as you know, we're good friends.
Yes.
I think Jeremiah Wright, who was Barack Obama's pastor there at Trinity, often also used the phrase prisoners of hope.
Yes.
And that, that God is not finished with us yet, even though God has good reason to be. A
final question, Tony. Lots of talk around renewal and revitalization, flourishing of the church, hope for the church. You mentioned earlier the kind of eccentric nature of churches that seem to be doing well. They're focused not just on their own internal life, but on the world outside of it. And this term missional comes up a lot. And it's used as an adjective, a noun, sometimes a verb now, too. So just wondering, so when people talk about mission, what is the mission of the church?
Well, I like the phrase, it seems to me it was in improbably some sort of Church of England document. Mm-hmm. It said the church does not have a mission. The God of mission has a church in the world.
Okay. Yeah.
And so there's God's mission, which I think has something to do with reclaiming God's creation, with mending our brokenness, both as individuals and as communities. Mm-hmm. And so being a part of the mission of God in the world seems to me to be a interesting and worthy hope. And I like that because churches tended in the Christendom period to kind of define mission as a part of the church's life and program. So we'd have a mission committee, and we talk about giving this percentage of our income to mission. And mission tended to be, at least in my part of the Christian world, mostly social service, corporeal acts of care, and justice advocacy. Now, those are fine, but I think mission is bigger than that. And I think the whole church's life is missional because we're trying to embody and follow Jesus, the kind of the sign and signal of God's mission in the world. And so I think the way you welcome people is missional. The way you read scripture is missional. The way you teach both formally and informally of all ages, all of that is mission. We're a mission outpost of God in a culture, a world that has lots of things to point to as accomplishments, but has lots of brokenness and despair. And so I just think the idea of segregating mission into one department of the church,
Yeah.
and kind of sending money to community service things is fine, but it's not enough. I think our mission is to really be a part of God's transforming work in the world and find ourselves changed in that experience.
I found that as pastor at a downtown church in Montreal, one of the big differences between generations was, for one generation, mission was done by proxy, and younger folks wanted to be involved in doing it themselves, wanted to be active agents in the world in Jesus' name.
Right.
And I've actually found that a hopeful sign for myself.
I agree. I think that's a very hopeful sign. And I can't tell you how many years I tried to talk congregations into having a position of coordinator of shared ministry. Mm-hmm. I started out by calling it volunteer coordinator, but then I noticed that Jesus actually didn't ask for volunteers. So I got rid of that. But the idea that you have somebody who helps build the bridge between this individual, this family, this group of people, and opportunities to be involved in God's work in the world, because so often what we would say to people is the best way to be a disciple of Christ is to serve on a bunch of committees. And that younger generation you're talking about just wasn't really up for that. They, and there's some downsides. You need some leadership in committees, but it's not the normative way to be a Christian, a follower of Christ. And I think the idea of not just sending money, but sending people is much more engaging.
Well, Tony, thank you very much for this opportunity to have a discussion today. I know you're busy with a variety of things, and thank you for your books. I didn't mention your commentary on Acts, which I have found so helpful for preaching. So thank you for that and for your time today. And this has been a really encouraging conversation.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you again for your leadership in the seminary world and the wider world that it's touching.
Thank you.
Very grateful for that.
Thank you.
Okay, blessings.
Bye-bye.